Welcome, brave listeners, to Wilhelm Presents Frightening Tales. I'm your host, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark and creepy tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from around the world. If you're an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 40 hours of previous content. Today's episode is written by the gruesome twosome A.J. Brown and S. Copperstone. A.J. Brown is a southern-born writer who tells emotionally charged, character-driven stories that often delve into the darker parts of the human psyche. Most of his stories have the southern country feel of his childhood. Though he writes mostly darker stories, he does so without any unnecessary gore, sex, or coarse language. More than 200 of his stories have been published in various online and print publications. He's been nominated for several awards and accolades over the years. If you would like to learn more about AJ, you can check out his blog, Type AJ Negative. You can also find him on Facebook, AJ Brown 36. Now, S. Copperstone is a nom de plume for someone who prefers to be somewhat anonymous. So let's tell you all about her. She's an eclectic writer who enjoys nature and writing unusual things about unusual topics. She can be found wandering the internet and visiting historical places when she's not out in nature. Her favorite genres to write include fantasy, horror, and historical fiction. Her current projects include a creative non-fiction with plans for more. Currently, all her books are on Amazon, but she's planning on printing and publishing 100% on her own with her next book, the aforementioned creative non-fiction. So, authors in place? Today's tale is called Treats at the Aver Residence.
Oh, they're going to love this year's treat,
Cade said, giddily. A broad smile stretched across his face. His eyes shimmered. He danced around the large steel table with a carving knife in hand. His milky eyes dazzled in the yellow glow of the overhead lights. He sang an old Christmas tune, changing the lyrics slightly to fit his needs. It's the most wonderful time of the year, where the children are sneaking and candy they're seeking with greatest of cheer. Oh, it's the most wonderful time of the year. Cade rubbed his throat with one long-fingered hand. He coughed, nodded his head, and smiled. Not too bad for an old man, he said. What do you think, Mr. Mason? On the table lay Mr. Mason, covered by a sheet up to his head. The man squirmed, his arms and legs pulled on the restraints that held him down. His eyes were wide orbs, glassy and full of fear. His dark hair was ruffled, and a bruise sat under his left eye. Cade lifted one eyebrow. His face loomed over Mr. Mason's. What? No response? He shook his head, despite the lack of response from Mr. Mason. The joy of the time of year, the very day, coursing through his veins, kept his spirits high. Not excited? That's okay. The children are gonna love you. That's later. For now, it's time to get busy. It's Halloween, Mr. Mason, the greatest day of the year. He checked the IV line running into Mason's arm. The steady drip told him that Mr. Mason would be flying high soon enough. All those years of being a surgeon come in handy this time of year, don't you think, Mr. Mason? Cade looked down into Mason's green eyes, red veins prominent on their whites. The man blinked, and a stray tear fell down the side of his face and into his hair. He let out a groan, not one of pain, but fear. Cade was certain if the white cloth shoved into his mouth wasn't there, Mason would scream for all he was worth. And at that moment, he may not have been worth much more than a cheap bottle of wine to any other drunk on this side of the road. But he was worth quite a lot to Cade. Don't worry. You'll only feel a moderate amount of pain, and for only a few seconds, maybe a minute. Then you'll pass out. He stroked Mason's sweaty cheek, as if he loved the man before him. Cade's eyes grew tender. His smile softened. Then you won't feel anything at all, at least until the children arrive. Mason shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. He strained to move. Though he wasn't bound in any way, he only managed to lift his head off the table. The veins on his forehead and along his throat bulged against his skin. "Oh, yes," Cade sang, then patted Mason's face. "It's going to be a wonderful Halloween." In their homes, children sang and danced. Their mothers painted their off-colored skin whatever shade of pale brown, green, or black they chose. Halloween shows played on the television. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, and The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy were their favorites. Those who were finished with their dinners sat and watched until the sun began to set. The anticipation made some of them bounce in their seats. Toes tapped, fingers drummed, teeth even chattered. Betsy Wallbanger's teeth fell out twice, and each time she put them back in, she had to adjust her lipstick. Excitement hung in the air. Would you like a smiley face or a frown? Or maybe a really scary face? Mason lifted his hands to the side of his face and wiggled the long fingers. He bared his teeth and growled. Mason shook his head and moaned again. None of those, I have templates this year. Got them cheap at the Walgreens in town. They practically gave them to me. Cade rubbed the blade of his knife against the side of his head. A small flap of skin peeled back, and a few strands of dirty, brittle hair flaked to the floor. A couple of beads of blood appeared on the edge of the new wound. Wow, that's sharp. I guess I should be careful where I put that. Cade pulled the sheet away like a magician putting on a show and looked at Mason's body. A pair of red underwear covered his privates. Other than that, Mason was nude. His belly was plump, the signs of a man who likes to eat, and eat well at that. I hope you don't mind, but I shaved your body while you were asleep. You had a lot of hair, and you know how kids are. Most of them just don't like hair on their treats. But I didn't shave your head. Some of them like to keep scalps for souvenirs these days. I wouldn't want to disappoint the few traditionalists still out there. Mason shook his head hard and let out a yell that was muffled by the cloth. He chewed on the rag as if trying to eat it so he could cry for help. I'm sorry that you don't approve, but you needed to shave. What's done is done. You just have to get over that now. Cade set the knife on a counter behind him and rifled through the templates.
Frankenstein? No. How about Shrek? He used to be popular with the kiddies.
After going through all the patterns, he set them down and picked up a black marker.
None of those will do. Not for you, Mr. Mason. I'll just have to come up with something on my own.
He stood over Mason's ample belly and drew an odd oval just below the ribs. He drew a second oval and then a triangle around Mason's belly button. Cade tapped his temple with the marker and looked up at the ceiling. Many images ran through his head until the right one came to mind. A smile creased his face.
Oh, you are going to love this!
He drew the large squiggly line below the triangle, then brought it down close to his underwear line. Cade picked up the knife and looked at Mason.
Are you ready for this?
Mason's screams were muffled as Cade plunged the knife into his stomach. Come on, let's get changed into your costume. The children squealed with joy when the mothers beckoned them to get ready for the festivities. They hurried to their rooms and donned their different outfits. There were vampires and werewolves, neither of which sparkled or walked around shirtless. They were witches with warts on their noses and brooms by their sides. They were zombies. Oh, so many of them were zombies. Betsy Wallabanger dressed up as a corpse bride, her hair jutting this way and that way, her outfit of natural dirty shade, complete with stains across the front. Her mother had worn that very costume when she was Betsy's age. There were no princesses or Batmans or video game stars. There were no cute little lions, tigers, or bears. Oh my! There was an Alice, and she carried a bucket shaped like the tardy rabbit's head. Every few steps it dripped blood. Not too much, just enough to make it appear as real as it was. They practiced the chants. They learned from Halloween's past, and their voices rang up to the ceilings, and none were off-key.
Trick or treat, smell my feet, give me something good to eat.
Some of the kids added extra verses, having learned them from the older kids.
If you don't, I won't cry, I'll slit your throat and then you'll die.
Mothers gave approving looks, and fathers ruffled the enthusiastic heads of the extra verse singers. There were few idle threats of behave or else. Those were reserved for parents in towns where Halloween was more of a burden than a rite of passage. Besides, the kids in Dread's Hollow knew the parents would never stick to their threats of no haunting the neighborhood if they behaved. It was just as much fun for the adults as it was for the children, so behaving wasn't allowed. Then there was always the one house at the end of Corpse Avenue that did something different each year. If anything, the parents wanted to see how Mr. Aver had decorated it. If there were no haunts for the kids, there was no visiting the Aver residence for the adults. Cade pulled away part of the flesh of Mason's stomach. He bit down on a piece of it, chewed and nodded. As blood dripped down his chin, he spoke, his voice thick.
A little on the raw side, but tasty.
He looked inside Mason's stomach. He had deadened the nerves and cauterized the flesh where he had carved away the precious meat. Blood still flowed from beneath the ribcage, and Mason still breathed, though shallow as it was. The carved face was gruesome, but Cade hadn't finished. He left a long slit by the reamed-out mouth. A mesh was in place, holding Mason's intestines in. Cade looked down at the man who had said, "Halloween is for the devil's children." He wanted to correct him. Oh, Halloween was so much more than for the offspring of the devil. It was for everyone, young and old, tall and small. The day didn't so much matter, but the spirit of Halloween. That's what drove Cade, and every other person who loved the day so much to celebrate it. He slapped Mr. Mason's face gently with a bloodied glove, leaving 4 red imprints on his face. "Stay with me, Mr. Mason. Your moment is coming soon, and you won't want to miss it." Cade carefully moved Mason's body onto a gurney he had procured from one of the medical catalogs he still received, though he hadn't practiced his once-chosen profession in well over 20 years. Mason moaned and opened his eyes. Gray bags clung beneath them, and he seemed to stare off at the ceiling, not noticing Cade at all. A few seconds later, his eyes slid closed again, and he became unconscious to the world around him. Cade pushed the gurney through the house and onto the front porch, out into the fresh autumn air. Cade took a deep breath. The chill filled his throat but burned his ancient lungs. Ah, I love this time of year. He worked like a cautious burglar, careful not to set any alarms off and give himself away. In Cade's case, he was careful not to jar Mason's body and have his efforts ruined by an act of clumsiness. He slid his arms under Mason's legs and back and carried him down to the steps. Cade sat him on a sturdy lawn chair, not bothering to brush off the leaves that had fallen on it or the spider web that hung between one armrest and the seat. The spider on the web crawled from one sticky line to another until it climbed into Mason's bare arm. Back inside, Cade grabbed the accessories, chip wrappers and empty beer cans. He littered the area around Mason with the garbage and placed one of the cans in the man's hand. Cade looked at his creation, the backdrop of his old house with its creaky steps, shuttered windows, and flaking paint would give anyone from outside Red Hollows the creeps. Those people would cautiously walk away, their eyes not wavering from the sight before them. Or they would run as if their hair was on fire. Cade smiled and shook with something akin to lust. His body tingled. His heart raced with excitement. They walked the streets of the neighborhood, clothed in their homemade outfits and masks. Each child's eyes beamed with excitement as they went from door to door. The welcome lights shone brightly at each house, luring the kids to knock and speak their chants. Neighbors opened doors, smiled, and played along. They oohed and ahed at the costumes. They told the children how scary and terrifying, and even how sickening they were. They gave them treats of lady fingers and animal eyes, of hair necklaces and cooked tongues. Some of the older teens tried to scare the younger kids, mostly to little success. "I got a rock," one kid said when he left each house. The other children laughed the first couple of times, but eventually grew tired of it and begged him to stop. Tunes of Trick or Treat rang throughout the night until they reached the Aver residence at the end of Corpse Avenue. A dim bulb hung from the ceiling of the porch. It cast shadows that looked like pointy fingers stretching across the ground. Cade stood on the porch, his face covered by a mask made of the skin from Mason's stomach. Children approached the house. Their bodies hummed with anticipation. Their eyes darted about the yard. Mason sat in the shadows near the porch, one hand wrapped around the beer can. He moaned weakly. The children stopped. Some of their parents leaned in to get a better look. "I call this Drunk Man Who Hates Halloween," Cade said, and flipped a switch that lit up the yard. Loud gasps echoed through the night as parents and children alike took in Cade's work. Mason's stomach had been carved out as if it was a normal pumpkin face. The lining of his insides burned black. A trickle of blood still washed down into the man's briefs. Mason's eyes had been stapled open and crusted blood clung to his face. His intestines, which had been held in by the mesh earlier, now dangled on Mason's lap. It appears as if they had been vomited out of the wide mouth of his belly. The cloth in his mouth from earlier was gone, and his bottom lip trembled. Betsy Wallabanger, 6 past 100 years of age, approached the creation cautiously. He's still alive, she said, and looked up at Cade with wide blue eyes that held childish excitement in them. She reached forward with one hand, then pulled it back quickly, uncertainty stretching across her face.
Go ahead. It's okay. He can't move,
Cade said with a grisly smile. Betsy set her pillowcase bag on the ground and leaned down. She sunk her teeth into one of Mason's thighs. He screamed weakly as she worked her jaw from side to side. She ripped off a piece of flesh, her teeth coming out slightly. She shoved them back in place and chewed. After she swallowed, she smiled.
Delicious.
Cade smiled and clapped his hands like the young child he no longer was once he died. He motioned with his hands.
Come, little ones, enjoy this year's treat from the Aver residence.
Children squealed as they lit in on Mason. His screams filled the night, much to Cade's satisfaction. The parents looked on, and some of them even joined them, with a happiness reserved for their ilk, as they partook of the fresh treat Cade had provided.
You really did outdo yourself this year, Aver,
one of the fathers said before he walked away with his little boy. Blood soaked the front of the boy's costume, and he licked his fingers clean of the blood that had been on them. Cade sat on the porch in an ancient rocker that squealed like a wounded rat as it went back and forth. The sounds of singing happy children had long since faded. What remained of Mason lay scattered on the lawn. There were bones here and there, a clump of hair by the sidewalk. The scalp had not been taken this year. One of the kids had bit off his privates. Or was it one of the moms? Cade didn't know, and honestly it didn't matter. The birds and bugs would come and clean up the mess, leaving only bones behind. On his lap sat a skull. Part of it was still pink from blood and meat. He pulled a piece of flesh from the cheekbone and plopped it in his mouth. He chewed, swallowed, then sang his favorite tune as he rocked back and forth.
Yes, it's the most wonderful time of the year. Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me on another dark story. I urge my listeners to go out and find more content by our weekly author, or in this case, authors. If you're not too timid, that is. If you enjoyed today's story and have tuned in on YouTube, please click the like button. And if you don't want to miss future stories, then click the old subscribe button. If you were present today on Spotify and enjoyed the story, you're more than welcome to leave a comment. If you're on Apple Podcast, please leave the show a rating as you see fit. All these little things add up over time. But wherever you listen, please, do me a favor and share the story if you can. Then tune in next week for another frightening tale, if you're brave enough.